You can't undo the past, Sandra.
You're...
I'm 52 years old, and 6 months ago I was delivering Chinese food in a battered Toyota Corolla when everything changed. I know how that sounds, like some clickbait nonsense you'd scroll past on social media, but I swear on everything I hold dear that this actually happened to me, and I still wake up some mornings convinced it was all a fever dream. Let me back up because this story doesn't make sense without context. A year ago, I had what most people would consider a pretty decent life. I'd spent 25 years working my way up at Caldwell Logistics, starting as a warehouse supervisor, making barely above minimum wage, and eventually becoming director of operations, pulling in a solid six-figure salary. I had a nice house in the suburbs outside Boston, drove a decent car, and most importantly, my 2 kids had turned out to be amazing people, despite their mother and me splitting up almost a decade ago. My daughter Emma was finishing her last semester of pharmacy school at Boston University, pulling straight A's and volunteering at Children's Hospital on weekends. My son Marcus had just opened his own accounting practice at 33, becoming the youngest certified public accountant in his firm's history. We weren't wealthy by any stretch, but we were comfortable and stable, you know? We had Sunday dinners twice a month at my place in the suburbs. Nothing fancy, but it was ours, and I was genuinely proud of the life I'd built after everything fell apart with their mother. The divorce from Sandra had been brutal when it happened, but we'd been apart long enough that the bitterness had mostly faded into mutual indifference. She'd always wanted more than I could give her, constantly pushing for a bigger house, fancier vacations, designer everything. Money was never enough for Sandra, and neither was I, apparently. After we split, she bounced around between a few different relationships, each one seemingly more desperate than the last, and honestly, I'd stopped keeping track of her life. Last I'd heard through mutual acquaintances, she was working as a receptionist at some dental office, and I figured that was the end of her story in my life. I was content being single, focusing on my career, and being there for my kids whenever they needed me. Emma would joke during dinners that I needed to start dating again, that 50 wasn't old these days, but I'd just laugh it off. After Sandra, I figured I'd had enough excitement for one lifetime. Then last summer, everything went sideways at the company's annual summer gala. Caldwell Logistics always went absolutely overboard for these events, renting out the ballroom at the Four Seasons, bringing in celebrity chefs, making everyone feel like royalty for one night, even though we'd all be back in our cubicles Monday morning. These corporate events are always kind of painful with forced small talk and overpriced catering, but you go because you're supposed to, because being seen matters in corporate culture. I was standing around with some colleagues from my department, actually having a decent time for once, when Gregory Caldwell himself walked over with a woman on his arm. Gregory was the CEO and owner, late 60s, never been married as far as anyone knew, always too busy building his logistics empire to settle down. Everyone knew him as brilliant but cold, the kind of guy who could quote profit margins from 5 years ago, but forgot his employees' names. When the woman turned around, I literally felt the blood drain from my face and my stomach drop to my shoes. It was Sandra, wearing what had to be a $10,000 designer gown that probably cost more than I made in a month, dripping with diamonds from her ears and neck, looking like she just stepped off a yacht in Monaco. She smiled at me with this triumphant, predatory look that I remembered way too well from our marriage. The expression she'd get right before dropping some bombshell that would ruin my week. Gregory introduced her as his fiancée, completely oblivious to our history, going on about how they'd met at some charity auction 3 months ago. Sandra played it cool, acting like we were just friendly exes who'd moved on with our lives, making small talk about how long it had been, and wasn't it funny how life worked out? But I saw it in her eyes, that calculating look she got when she was planning something, when the gears were turning behind that smile. My entire team stood frozen around me, everyone suddenly very interested in their champagne glasses. The tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. My assistant Karen pulled me aside later that evening and warned me to watch my back. Said Sandra had been looking at me like a cat watching a mouse all night, and nothing good ever came from that woman's attention. Over the next few weeks, Sandra started showing up at the office constantly, way more than made sense for someone who was just visiting their fiancé. She'd come to have lunch with Gregory, but always made a point of stopping by my floor, asking about Emma and Marcus in this fake sweet voice that made my skin crawl, wondering how they were doing as if she'd been a present mother instead of someone who'd missed 8 years of birthdays and graduations. She'd attend meetings she had absolutely no business being in, sitting next to Gregory, whispering in his ear while staring directly at me from across the conference table. It felt like psychological warfare, and I had no idea why she was doing it or what endgame she was planning. The whole situation gave me this terrible anxiety, like waiting for a piano to fall on your head but not knowing when. Marcus, who'd become a pretty sharp lawyer despite his young age, told me to start documenting everything during one of our Sunday dinners. He said something felt deeply wrong about the whole situation, that Sandra never did anything without a reason, and that reason was usually profit-driven. Emma agreed, said she'd never trusted our mother's motives for anything. I wish I'd listened more carefully to my kids, wish I'd taken their warnings seriously instead of brushing them off as overprotective worry. Looking back, my mother, Dorothy, who'd passed away 5 years ago from cancer, would have seen this coming from a mile away. She'd always been suspicious of people with too much charm and too little conscience. "Michael, you're too trusting, just like your father was," she used to say before she got sick. "David saw the good in everyone, even when there wasn't any good to find." Mom had raised me alone after Dad died in that construction accident when I was 3 years old. She worked double shifts at Boston General Hospital for 30 years, putting me through school, never complaining about raising a kid alone. 3 months after that gala, my entire life imploded in the span of a single week, and it started on a Monday morning that seemed perfectly normal. I got called into Human Resources at 7:30, which was unusual but not unheard of. When I walked into the conference room, there were 2 security guards positioned at the door like I was some kind of flight risk, and Patricia Wilson, the head of Human Resources, was sitting behind the table looking at me like I'd personally ruined her life. She slid a thick stack of papers across the table and told me in this cold, clinical voice that there was extensive evidence I'd been stealing from the company for the past 4 months. According to their records, I'd been using my high-level security clearance to systematically divert shipments worth over $3 million to unknown locations. I was completely stunned, couldn't even process what she was saying at first. The documents showed my access codes, my digital signatures, detailed timestamps of me supposedly entering secured warehouse areas at 3 in the morning on multiple occasions. But I hadn't been anywhere near those warehouses, hadn't used my override codes for anything unusual in months. I demanded to see security camera footage that would prove I wasn't there, but they claimed the cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during every single incident, and the backup systems had also failed. 53 separate diversions over 4 months, all perfectly timed to camera blackouts. The whole thing was so obviously fabricated that I couldn't believe they expected me to just accept it. They gave me a choice right there: resign immediately and sign a non-disclosure agreement, or face criminal prosecution that would destroy not just me, but my kids' futures too. Patricia specifically mentioned Marcus's new business. How terrible it would look for a CPA if his father was convicted of corporate theft. How Emma's pharmacy license application might be affected by having a convicted felon as a parent. She said Gregory was hoping to avoid embarrassing my family, which was rich coming from the man who was orchestrating this whole thing. The threat was crystal clear and absolutely terrifying. I refused to resign for something I didn't do. Told them I wanted my lawyer present immediately. Patricia's expression didn't change at all when she said I was suspended effective immediately and security would escort me out. The walk through the office I'd helped build over 2.5 decades was the longest, most humiliating experience of my entire life. 47 faces from my team watching as security guards marched me out like a criminal, like someone they'd never known. Karen was openly crying at her desk, and Dennis from accounting, who I'd worked with for 15 years and who'd been named Employee of the Month 3 times under my management, couldn't even look me in the eye. Everyone else just stared or pretended to be very interested in their computer screens suddenly. The next day, Tuesday morning at 6 a.m., police showed up at my house with a warrant. They tore the place apart looking for evidence, going through every drawer and closet, confiscating all my electronics, including my personal laptop and phone, treating me like I was running a pills cartel. My neighbors, people I'd known for 8 years, people I'd had barbecues with and helped shovel snow for, watched from their windows and doorways as officers led me out in handcuffs. Mrs. Peterson next door actually recorded it on her phone, and I saw her post it to Facebook that afternoon. Emma called sobbing from her dorm, asking what was happening, and I had to tell my baby girl it was all a misunderstanding while sitting in the back of a police car. Marcus tried calling, but I couldn't answer because they'd taken my phone. By Wednesday afternoon, every major logistics company in New England had received a detailed email from Caldwell Logistics about my supposed integrity issues and the ongoing criminal investigation. My professional reputation, painstakingly built over 25 years of showing up early, staying late, and treating people with respect, evaporated overnight like morning dew. My LinkedIn inbox flooded with messages from connections distancing themselves, removing recommendations, basically erasing me from their networks. 25 years of relationships and networking gone in 25 hours. People I'd helped get promotions. People whose kids I'd given recommendations for. Suddenly couldn't remember my name. That evening, Wednesday at 6 p.m., I got a text from Sandra that I'll never forget. "Hope you enjoy your new life, Mike. You were always too small time for someone like me. Gregory says hello and thanks for making this so easy." That's when I knew with absolute certainty that this whole thing was orchestrated, that Sandra and Gregory had planned my destruction together, probably over champagne and caviar while laughing about how easy it would be. I called Marcus immediately, told him I needed a lawyer who wasn't afraid of Gregory Caldwell. He offered to represent me himself, but I refused. He just made partner, and I wouldn't let them destroy his career too. I hired the best criminal defense attorney I could afford, a guy named Richard Chen, who cost $500 per hour. But Gregory's legal team was absolutely relentless. They buried us in motions and paperwork, dragging out every single proceeding, making continuances, basically using the legal system as a tool, while my savings account hemorrhaged money like a severed artery. By month 3, I'd lost the house to foreclosure because I couldn't make mortgage payments without income, sold my car for a fraction of what it was worth, and was living in a studio apartment that smelled like old cigarettes and broken dreams. The place was in a rough neighborhood, sirens every night, and cost $800 a month that I could barely scrape together. Richard finally admitted to me over coffee that Gregory had done this exact same thing before to other executives who'd crossed him somehow, and none of them had successfully fought back or cleared their names. He showed me records of 3 other cases with identical patterns: planted evidence, malfunctioning cameras, digital signatures used at impossible times. It was a perfected system, and Gregory had the resources to make it stick no matter how innocent you actually were. Emma wanted to drop out of pharmacy school to work full-time and help me pay legal bills, but I absolutely refused. I told her I'd rather live on the street than let Gregory's lies steal my daughter's future and her dreams of becoming a pharmacist. Marcus tried to loan me money from his business account, but he'd just started his practice and was barely breaking even himself, still paying off his own student loans. I couldn't take money from my kids when this was my battle to fight. I sold everything I owned of value: my father's watch that Mom had given me before she died, some furniture, anything that wasn't nailed down. The only job I could get was delivering food for Golden Dragon Chinese restaurant on the south side. The owner, Mr. Chen, was an older Chinese immigrant who didn't care about background checks or references or what the internet said about you. He just needed reliable drivers who showed up on time and didn't steal from customers. "You show up, you work hard, you get paid. I don't care what papers say," he told me in broken English. So there I was, 52 years old with a college degree and 25 years of corporate experience, delivering lo mein and fried rice in a beat-up Toyota Corolla with a magnetic restaurant sign stuck to the door. The car cost me $1,500 from a sketchy used lot, barely passed inspection, and burned oil like crazy. But it ran, and that's all that mattered. The humiliation was constant and soul-crushing. I delivered to former coworkers who couldn't look me in the eye, who'd close the door quickly after grabbing their food like I had something contagious. I delivered to neighbors who suddenly found their phones very interesting, who'd hand me money without a word like I was invisible. One night, I delivered to one of Sandra's old friends from our marriage, a woman named Carol who'd been to our house dozens of times for dinner parties, and she actually laughed when she saw me. She recorded me on her phone while handing me a $20 bill as a condescending pity tip, making some comment about how far people can fall and posting it to her Instagram story. I saw it later because someone sent it to me anonymously. 4 months into this nightmare, I'd mostly given up on fighting or hoping things would change. Pride doesn't pay rent or put gas in a dying car. I did my deliveries, avoided anywhere I might see people from my old life, and tried not to think about how I'd gone from running operations for a billion-dollar company with 47 people reporting to me to scraping together enough money for gas and ramen noodles. My lawyer had stopped returning calls as promptly because I couldn't pay his retainer anymore, The case was stalling out and everyone knew it. The man who'd been named Manager of the Year 3 times was now worried about making rent and keeping the lights on. Then came that rainy December night that changed everything. The order came through around 8 p.m., one of the last deliveries of my shift. The ticket said 1847 Riverside Drive, which I knew was one of those massive estates in the wealthy part of town where old money lived, the kind of neighborhood where people had circular driveways and professional landscaping crews. One order of General Tso's chicken and vegetable fried rice, total $32 with delivery fee included. These rich neighborhood deliveries usually meant decent tips, sometimes 20 or 30 bucks from people who barely noticed what they were spending. Maybe enough to cover my gas for the entire night and leave a little extra for groceries. I pulled up to this enormous colonial house that probably had 8 bedrooms and cost several $1,000,000, with perfectly manicured hedges even in winter. The rain was coming down in sheets, absolutely pouring, soaking through my thin jacket within seconds. I grabbed the insulated delivery bag and ran through the downpour to the front door, rang the bell, and waited while water dripped off my nose and my shoes squished with every movement. When the old man answered, he took one look at my face and literally collapsed to his knees right there in the doorway. I thought he was having a heart attack or a stroke, and I immediately reached for my phone to call emergency, but he grabbed my arm with surprising strength for someone who had to be pushing 80 years old. His hands were shaking, and there were tears streaming down his weathered face, mixing with the rain. "Dear God," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "You're David Mitchell's son. You have to be. Those eyes, that jawline, even that scar above your left eyebrow. You look exactly like him when he was young." I froze completely, my mind going blank. Nobody talked about my father, ever. He died in a construction accident when I was 3 years old, and my mother had packed away most memories of him into a box before passing away herself 5 years ago from cancer. I barely knew anything about him, except the few stories Mom had told me before she got too sick to talk much. She'd worked double shifts at Boston General Hospital for 30 years, putting me through school, never complaining about raising a kid alone. The old man pulled me inside his house, practically dragging me past the entryway despite his age. His living room looked like a shrine to the past, with black and white photographs covering every wall, boxes of documents and papers stacked everywhere, filing cabinets lining one entire side of the room. He grabbed a specific photograph from the mantel with shaking hands, holding it up to my face like he was comparing features. "This is your father and me in 1984, the day we incorporated Mitchell Drummond Properties together. We signed the papers that morning." The photo showed 2 young guys in work clothes and hard hats, standing in front of what looked like a huge muddy field, both grinning at the camera like they'd just won the lottery. One of them could have been my twin at age 25, same dark hair, same jawline, same slight crook in the nose that I'd always been self-conscious about. It was like looking at myself in a time machine, and it took my breath away. The old man's name was Harrison Drummond, and what he told me over the next 2 hours while my delivery bag sat forgotten on his expensive leather couch changed absolutely everything about my understanding of my own life. He and my dad had met working construction jobs around Boston back in the early 80s, became close friends despite their different backgrounds. They'd spend lunch breaks talking about making it big someday, about building something that mattered instead of just collecting paychecks and watching other people get rich. When a 75-acre parcel of undeveloped swampland came up for auction 30 miles outside the city, they decided to take a massive risk together. They scraped together $100,000 between them, my dad taking out a second mortgage on my parents' modest house in Dorchester and draining his entire life savings, Harrison selling his car and borrowing from relatives. They incorporated as equal partners, 50-50 split on everything, calling themselves Mitchell Drummond Properties. Everyone thought they were crazy, Harrison explained. Who builds on swampland 30 miles from the city when there's no infrastructure and no interest? But the city zoning board rejected their development plans repeatedly, 6 times over 18 months. Environmental groups fought them tooth and nail, claiming the land was protected wetlands. Local residents opposed any development, filed lawsuit after lawsuit. After 18 months of rejection and mounting debt from legal fees and land taxes, my dad thought he'd ruined his family financially, that he'd gambled away everything on a stupid dream. Then, 2 months later, he died when scaffolding collapsed at a construction site on Route 93. He was 31 years old and my mom was 8 months pregnant with me. Harrison went to the funeral, Tried to talk to my mom about the business and what would happen with the property, but she was completely devastated by losing her husband. She screamed at Harrison to leave and never contact her again. Said she never wanted to hear another word about my dad's failed business ventures that had mortgaged their future and left her alone and pregnant. She moved away right after I was born, relocating to a different part of Boston where nobody knew her story, and Harrison lost track of us completely. He hired private investigators over the years, spent thousands of dollars trying to find David Mitchell's widow and son, but Mom had covered her tracks extremely well, probably wanting to escape all reminders of what she'd lost and start fresh without the weight of failure hanging over her. Here's where the story gets absolutely insane, the part that still makes my head spin. 6 months after my dad died, everything changed overnight. The state announced a massive technology corridor initiative, a billion-dollar development plan to attract tech companies to the region and compete with Silicon Valley. Suddenly, that worthless swampland my dad had died thinking was his biggest failure became some of the most valuable real estate in New England. The permits got approved overnight, environmental concerns mysteriously disappeared, and the project was greenlit with full government backing and tax incentives. Harrison developed the property, but he did something unusual that most business partners wouldn't have done, something that speaks to his character. He put my dad's 50% into a trust, keeping meticulous records of every transaction, every lease agreement, every dollar of income and expense. For 30 years, he collected rent from tenants, reinvested profits wisely, and maintained detailed documentation of everything in those filing cabinets, waiting for the day he could find my dad's son and give him what was rightfully his. 30 years later, that muddy swampland had become the Riverside Technology Corridor, one of the most successful commercial developments in the entire state. Google built their East Coast data center there on Lot 22. Amazon had a massive distribution hub on Lot 15. Microsoft, Oracle, 3 major hospitals, 47 office buildings, 2 shopping centers, all paying monthly rent to Mitchell Drummond Properties. The rent checks just kept coming, Harrison explained, and the money kept growing with compound interest and smart reinvestment. Harrison showed me bank statements, lease agreements, 3 decades of documentation, all carefully organized in those filing cabinets. His hands were still shaking as he slid a folder across his coffee table, and I could see tears in his eyes. Your father's share is currently valued at $947 million, he said quietly, letting that number hang in the air. But Michael, there's something else you need to know. Something that I think will matter to you even more than the money right now. He pulled out a specific lease agreement from another folder, and my heart stopped completely when I saw the signature at the bottom. Gregory Caldwell's name was right there in black ink, bold and confident. Caldwell Logistics had been Mitchell Drummond's anchor tenant for 17 years, occupying the largest building in the entire complex, a massive warehouse and office facility that housed their entire East Coast operation. His whole empire operated from that location on Lot 34. There's a clause I insisted on in every single lease we ever wrote, Harrison explained, pulling out the standard contract to show me the specific language. Any tenant found engaging in fraud, harassment, or unethical business practices can be evicted with 30 days' notice. No exceptions, no appeals, ironclad. Your father believed business should be conducted with integrity and honor. We built that principle into every contract, every agreement. It was non-negotiable for us. I sat there on this stranger's expensive couch, still wearing my wet delivery jacket with the Golden Dragon logo, trying to process what I was hearing. The delivery bag had spilled on his Persian rug, but neither of us cared. My father, who I'd never really known, who died thinking he was a complete failure, had left me a fortune built on principles. The man who'd systematically destroyed my life for sport, who'd married my ex-wife specifically to get close enough to crush me, had been operating his entire business empire on property my father owned, property I now owned half of. Mr. Drummond, I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the shock coursing through my body. I think it's time Mr. Caldwell met his new landlord. Harrison smiled for the first time, and it was like watching the sun come out from behind storm clouds. I already called my attorneys when I saw your name on the delivery order, and nearly had a heart attack from shock. Rebecca Chen from Chen & Associates, the best real estate litigation lawyer in the state. She's expecting to hear from you tomorrow morning at 9 sharp. I've been searching for you for 30 years, Michael. 30 years. The lawyers moved incredibly fast once they understood the situation and what Gregory had done. Within a week, they'd verified everything, established my inheritance legally with the courts, reviewed all their relevant documents and trust paperwork, and most importantly, examined every single lease on Mitchell Drummond property with a microscope. The integrity clause Harrison had written was absolutely bulletproof, written in language that even Gregory's army of expensive corporate lawyers couldn't dispute or find loopholes in. "Mr. Mitchell," Rebecca said during our first meeting in her downtown office overlooking the harbor, "you don't just have leverage here. You have a nuclear option. Caldwell Logistics can't relocate their operation without catastrophic financial losses. We're talking hundreds of millions in specialized equipment, established supply chain infrastructure, logistics networks, client relationships. The specialized manufacturing equipment alone would cost $50 million to relocate. Moving would essentially destroy the company or set them back a decade." I sat in my beat-up Toyota outside Caldwell Logistics headquarters the next morning, watching people stream into the building I used to enter every single day for 25 years. My phone rang, Sandra's name flashing on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her panicked, rambling message about some lease emergency and Gregory's attorneys calling non-stop about ownership changes, and did I know anything about this? I called her back and kept my voice completely calm, almost bored. "Tell Gregory his landlord wants to discuss his recent business practices. Meetings in 1 hour. Conference room B." "What are you talking about?" Her voice was shrill with panic, that fake composure completely gone. "You deliver Chinese food, Mike. What landlord? Have you lost your mind?" "Not anymore. Oh, and Sandra, that penthouse Gregory bought you last month in the Riverside Towers complex? Also built on Mitchell Drummond land. Everything you can see from your balcony, we own it. See you in an hour." The meeting was something straight out of a movie. I walked into my old office building wearing my best suit, the one I'd managed to keep from before everything fell apart, with Rebecca's team of 6 lawyers walking behind me in perfect formation, like some kind of legal SWAT team. We rode the elevator to the executive floor, the 40th floor that I'd only visited for major company presentations, and walked into conference room B. Gregory was already there with what looked like his entire legal department, 12 attorneys arranged around the table like a defensive wall. Sandra sat beside him looking pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. When I took the seat at the head of the table, the power position, Gregory's face went through confusion, rage, and fear in rapid succession. Rebecca laid out the situation in clear professional language. I had inherited 50% of Mitchell Drummond properties from my late father. The lease on this building expired in exactly 45 days. The integrity clause gave us legal grounds for immediate termination based on documented evidence of falsifying theft accusations against multiple employees over several years. "We have sworn statements from 19 former employees," Rebecca said calmly, opening her laptop. "All terminated using identical methods over the past 5 years. Fabricated digital access logs, mysteriously malfunctioning security cameras, planted evidence. The pattern is unmistakable and legally actionable under the terms of your lease agreement." Gregory tried to bluster, his face turning red, claiming we had no proof, that he'd sue us into oblivion, but his lead attorney was already whispering urgently in his ear. I could see the exact moment Gregory realized his entire empire was built on land I controlled. I let the reality sink in for a full minute. "You have 2 options, Gregory. Option 1, vacate the premises in 30 days. Relocate your entire operation. Good luck finding comparable space on that timeline. Your board will love explaining the losses to shareholders. Option 2, you publicly clear my name with a full statement to every company you contacted, pay $25 million in damages to me personally, sign a new lease at 5 times the current rate, and file for divorce from Sandra within 1 week." "You can't force me to divorce her," Gregory shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "No, but I can make staying married to her extraordinarily expensive. Every month you remain married, the rent doubles. Month 1, $20 million. Month 2, $40 million. Month 3, $80 million. Let's see how long your board lets you keep her when she's costing the company that much monthly." Sandra was backing toward the door. "Mike, baby, this got out of hand. We can work this out. Remember the good times?" I didn't look at her. "You have 24 hours to decide, Gregory. After that, we start eviction proceedings and release everything to media. The Boston Globe is already interested." He tried fighting, but within 48 hours, his board called an emergency meeting. Rebecca had sent them all the evidence. The story leaked, and Gregory wasn't a genius anymore, but the billionaire who destroyed families for sport. The board gave him a choice: resign or be fired and face charges. He resigned. Divorce papers were filed within a week. Sandra sent hundreds of desperate messages. I never responded except once, when she showed up at Golden Dragon. I still delivered Fridays, not for money, but because Mr. Chen had treated me with dignity. "I'm sorry," Sandra said in the rain. "You're sorry you got caught," I said flatly. "Your order's $32.50. That was the last time I saw her. We compensated all 19 employees Gregory destroyed. Each got $3 million. Karen cried on the phone. "You saved all of us." Harrison became like the father I never had. We converted a third of Riverside into affordable housing. We started the David Mitchell Foundation with $100 million, helping 300 families the first year. Emma graduated debt-free, now runs a community clinic. Marcus defends employees pro bono, won his first case in 3 weeks. My granddaughter Dorothy will grow up knowing her family name means helping people. Standing in my father's office, Harrison said, "David would be so proud. You reclaimed his dream of lifting others up." I looked at my father's photo, that young man who died thinking he'd failed, never knowing he'd built an empire on principles that would save his son. The best revenge was handing keys to a single mother, moving into our housing, knowing I was using my father's legacy as he'd wanted. My dad left me more than wealth. He left me purpose, worth more than any dollar amount. Sometimes you lose everything to find what matters, and sometimes people trying to bury you plant seeds instead.